Appreciate that. Good to see everybody tonight, as usual, and hope our discussion in Acts 27 will be profitable. It's really just a summary of Paul's voyage to Rome, so it's not really a chapter, chock full of doctrinal kinds of things. But I think it's important in the big scheme of things as far as, what took place. We have several references to the fact that God said that he's going to visit Rome, or that he's going to go to Rome. He's going to be before kings. You can go all the way back to Acts 9 and verse 15. You remember when Ananias had a little bit of a problem going to Paul because of what he had heard about him, and Jesus told him that he is a chosen vessel to me, and he's going to bear my name before the Jews, before the Gentiles, before kings, which he's already done. And he's going to, of course, another king or emperor, I guess you'd say, would be Caesar, because of his appeal after Paul's appeal to Caesar after all of the things that had happened to him relative to his arrest in Acts 21, and what all took place there in Jerusalem and then in Caesarea when he went to Caesarea. His arrest, as we mentioned, was in Acts 21, down about verse 28 or 29 or thereabouts. We won't go all the way back through that. But the last 5 or 6 chapters that we've looked at and studied, then after his arrest in Jerusalem in Acts 21 and Acts 22, he defended himself before the people, might even say a mob really, but before the people. He didn't get a chance to finish his remarks because of the uproar that was there at that particular time. And then in Acts 23, he had his defense before the Sanhedrin, and of course, once the Pharisees, the Sadducees disagreed over Paul, the Pharisees, of course, said he's not such a bad guy; he's a good guy because he believes the same way we believe, and so of course the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, and so that created uproar. So he didn't get a chance to finish his defense there. And then in Acts 24, Felix took him to Caesarea to get him away from the mob, took 470 people with him to take him to Caesarea, appeared before Felix there in Acts 24. In Acts 25, we find his defense before Festus, and of course we know the situation with Felix and how Felix trembled and so forth at the sermon that Paul preached to him. Then Festus in 25. And then in Acts 26, Agrippa comes on the scene, and he comes to Caesarea to salute Festus, who had taken over as the governor there in that area. And so he wanted to hear Paul. So he heard him, and of course Agrippa said, "Almost you persuaded me to be a Christian." And then at the end of that chapter, where we were the other day, Agrippa and Festus came outside. They reasoned among themselves and said, this man, might have been freed had he not appealed to Caesar. There was nothing wrong with Paul. They couldn't prove anything. All the things that they had accused him of, the sedition, the preaching of false doctrine, illegal doctrine and so forth, he defended himself in terms of telling them that he goes all the way back to the law of Moses, the prophets, and so forth, and that all I'm doing is preaching what the law and the prophets said was going to come. And so he didn't do any of the things, all of the things that he was accused of course, he was innocent in all of that. So then in Acts 27, we have the voyage to Rome that we'll look at tonight, and then in Acts 28, we find him in Rome under house arrest. Most of the scholars think this would be somewhere around 61 AD or thereabouts. He was 2 years under house arrest or thereabouts. That's mentioned there in Acts 28. We don't find any record of him being before Caesar, but evidently at some point he was released at that point in time. We don't have a record of what actually took place, but evidently he was released somewhere around 63 AD, some of the Bible scholars think. And then he lived and preached another 4 or 5 years, in which he wrote 1 Timothy, Titus, and then toward the end of his life, 2 Timothy. Some think he wrote 1 Timothy around in the autumn of 63 AD or the early 64 AD. Titus somewhere along about that same time, and then toward the end of his life, he wrote a second letter to Timothy. Some think maybe AD 66 or 67, and then was put to death somewhere around AD 67 or thereabouts, maybe 68. So that's kind of the summary of it at the end, but that's kind of what we'll look at beginning in Acts 27 about the voyage itself. You know, he didn't waste any time though. When he was in Rome, what did he actually do? What were the books that he actually wrote while he was a prisoner in Rome?
Philippians,
Philemon,
and then Ephesians.
Ephesians, and
Yeah. It was like Philippians, Colossians.
Colossians. Yeah, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. So wrote 4 of his books, 4 of the 13, 14 if we count Hebrews. So he wrote 4 of those while a prisoner. In addition to that, we know that he had some contact and some success in Caesar's household. We don't know exactly who all was converted there, but let's see, is it Romans 16? I wrote that down somewhere. Romans 16, I can't think of the name, the verse, but Romans 16, salute those, or maybe it's Philippians that I'm thinking of. Might have been Philippians 4, 21 or 22. One of those, that, and I had it written down, guys, but where salute those of Caesar's household and so forth. Some of you scholars don't know where that is, but I can't remember if it's Romans 16 or I think it's Romans 16. But there's a statement also in Philippians 4:22. I want to read just a couple of those anyway. Back in Acts, while y'all are looking at it, you can tell me if you find it. But in Acts 23, we're talking about the fact that God had told Ananias in Acts 9 that he was a chosen vessel to him. He was going to bear his name before the Jews, the Gentiles, and kings. And then in Acts 23 and verse 11, this was during the this would have been during his defense before the Sanhedrin. And then in Acts 23, I think it's verse 11, and the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem," which that's where he was arrested, "so must thou bear witness also at Rome." So even though he went to Rome as a prisoner, he didn't go the way he had probably thought he was going to go. But that was in fulfillment of what the Lord said to him there in Acts 23 and verse 11. And then over in Acts 27, and I believe it's down about verse 23, you remember when they had the problem there where they had the hurricane or the problem there with the ship and so forth, and then Paul, of course, he was admonishing them that you should have listened to him and not had gone out in the gale and so forth. He said, but he said, and now I exhort you to be of good cheer, Acts 27:22, with all the problems they have, and notice how he puts it, and now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall no loss of any man's life, there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. So that's another example of you're going to make it to Rome, you're going to make it before Caesar. No loss of life for these 276 that are on the ship with you. There's not going to be any loss of life. and everything is going to be taken care of. That verse that I wanted to mention there, I think it's,
Well, back in 16, Lester,
it's Philippians.
he mentioned several people, but I didn't see Caesar's house, so
Okay, let's see, Lord, let me see.
I might have missed it. But,
Yeah, I was wrong. I had it written down. It's Philippians 4:22. When he was writing this from prison, and he said in Philippians 4 verse 22, all the saints salute you, chiefly they that are of Caesar's household. So there were some saints, and in other words, implied in the statement there, all the saints salute you, chiefly they that are of Caesar's household. So he converted some in Caesar's household, evidently. There were some saints in Caesar's household, according to that. So that's when he wrote one of the prison epistles there. I couldn't get the verse there. I had it written down. I even put it in red, and I still didn't. No, that was in Acts 9:15.
Some of the books that were prison epistles were written in Caesarea in this time.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know which, but they go back.
Exactly, exactly. Because he had 2 years of being a prisoner in Caesarea, roughly 2 years. 2 years in Rome, thereabouts, that we're talking about now. And then later on, the third imprisonment, we don't know how long it lasted. Some think it might have been a year or, before they actually killed him there around 67 AD or thereabouts. So we know of those three. And as Israel said, there's some that think that he either wrote or began writing or maybe wrote maybe one or two of those books there in Caesarea before he actually got to Rome. And that would have been in line with what the scholars say about prison officials, because he was a prisoner there for 2 years in Caesarea at this particular point in time before they began the voyage to Rome. I wanted to just look at the map with you real quick. I was trying to get this so you can see where it is. It's hard for you to see it here in the hyphenated line there. But starting with Caesarea, you can see maybe the little dashes there. Start at Caesarea, goes up to Sidon, goes near Cyprus, and we'll read about that in just a second. Near Cyprus, Salamis there, a city in Cyprus, went around the northeast corner, and came down to a city called Myra, that we'll read about here in just a minute. Came over near Cnidus, which is mentioned there in Acts 27, and then down toward Crete, Salmone, one of the cities there on the eastern edge of Crete, over to Lycia and the Fair Havens, read about that. And then Cauda, the little island there, near Phoenix. The Bible says, King James mentions that as Phoenice. I guess you pronounce that Phenice, Phoenix or Phoenice. Most places put it as Phoenix. And then Cauda or Clauda. I've seen it both ways, Clauda and Cauda. And then across the Mediterranean is journey on up to Melita. The Bible calls that Melita. It's also called Malta. Lord, I don't know if you can see that.
yeah, I see all that.
All the way up, this Paul's journey from there, up to Malta or Melita, and then sailed by what was called Syracuse, and then in between Sicily and I guess the rest of Italy there, you got the boot here, as they call it, the boot of Italy, up through this point, and then on to, the Bible mentions Puteoli, on up to Appia Forum, which is mentioned here, and then the Three Taverns, and then on to Rome. It's real close. I didn't realize until I started looking at this today, real close to Pompeii, which I've seen a lot about lately. I know Keith has talked about that too, about the destruction of Mount Vesuvius destroying Pompeii. And Elaine and I were watching something the other day about that, about destruction of Pompeii. So,
And then you was going to Mobile when they had that exhibit over there at Pompeii.
I don't know. Lord, I never see it. I do. Did you?
Actual bodies of Pompeii.
Is that right?
It was a city, right?
Yeah.
They had a big exhibit. This is several years.
Is that right? Well, it's quite a documentary on Pompeii on I don't know if it's YouTube or one of those things, Netflix or YouTube, one of those that you can pull up. And we watched some the other day, a couple of them. It's really interesting about how they depict what actually happened and so forth.
Fast too.
It happened so fast, yeah.
People-
So he sailed by that real close, and so that would have been about 17, 18 years before that actually happened. You know, it happened in AD 79, I think, the destruction of Pompeii, I believe. And so he was sailing here somewhere around 61 AD or thereabouts.
And you may have mentioned this already in Acts 24, but Drusilla, history says she was killed at Pompeii.
Yeah, that's right. I remember you mentioned that.
So it's interesting that she got here, Paul, and wonders that lava's coming to her. She thought about any of Paul's words.
Yeah, you wonder about
before she's
that.
to die.
That's a good point. Good
Priscilla,
point.
Aquila and Priscilla?
Drusilla.
Drusilla.
Drusilla, oh,
Wife of,
Drusilla, okay, yeah.
Felix.
yeah.
Felix, yeah.
Okay.
Where Felix and Drusilla were hearing Paul's case there
Yeah.
in Acts 24, I believe it was. So I don't know exactly how long it was, but where they give you a little scale, I kind of put a little piece of cardboard there and just kind of tracked as best I could. It looked to me like it was over 2,200 miles. I'm not sure. Somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 miles from Caesarea, the way that they went. And of course, it could have been longer than that because of the way the boat did, but somewhere over 2,000 miles anyway. So it took them a long time to get there. I don't know how long it was. It doesn't really say, but it's a long voyage, that's for sure. But the interesting thing about it is Paul didn't waste any time. That was the thing. First of all, he saved, at least physically saved, caused to be saved, 276 passengers on board. I don't know how many of them became Christians, if any. But when he got to Rome, he certainly had an audience. We know, besides Caesar's household, that there were some that believed and obeyed the gospel, because in Acts 28, down about verse 24, what does it say? He preached from morning till evening. Some believed the things that he said, some believed not. So we know that he converted some of them, plus some in Caesar's household, during that 2-year period. So he didn't waste any time, plus writing 4 books, if all 4 of them were written from Rome. As Israel said, he might have written 1 or 2 of those in Caesarea, but be that as it may, in that whole time frame there, that 3 or 4 year period, he was a very busy man. And I think we mentioned it before, but I think a case could be made that other than Jesus himself, he was the most significant person, most influential person, most significant person, any way you want to put it, the greatest person in the New Testament. I don't think there's even anybody close to second. Do y'all think when you look at what he did, writing 13 books or 14 books, all the people, all the ones that he converted, all the things that he went through to get to that point, all the times he was run out of town, the beatings, the shipwrecks, the stonings, the hunger, the thirst, all the things that he had to deal with, plus the care of all the churches that he established. And then following up with that, with these 3 missionary journeys, plus the voyage to Rome, in which is almost like a 4th missionary journey, if you want to look at it that way. Some people even consider that a 4th missionary journey, because in a sense it was, because of the people that he converted once he got to Rome, for sure, and the influence that he had in writing the letters that he wrote toward the end of his life during that period of time from about 61 to 63 AD. So he was a remarkable person, and I don't know of anyone that's more important or more significant. I mean, you could even make a case for him in the whole Bible, the most significant person in the whole Bible, other than the Lord himself, of course. And I mentioned to you before, when I got this book, the 100 most influential people in history, he was ranked number 6. That's pretty good to be ranked in the top 10 in that catalog.
And he could say he learned to be content in whatever situation he's in.
And whatever situation he's in. Yep.
Whoever put that together and put him number 6, Christ should have been number 1, and
Absolutely.
number 2.
Yeah.
That wasn't written by a Bible student.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I would have put him number 2 behind the Lord. If you look at it.
The Lord changed the world, of course.
Now you know who number 1 was, don't you, Israel?
Unfortunately,
I know. I hate to even mention that.
That being that Mohammed.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you got even Sir Isaac Newton and some others that, in there in 3rd and 4th, that sort of thing. So.
They had a pedophile and a guy who just copied what God
Yeah,
did.
I've got one of those books. I think I brought it one time and shared some of those with you, some of the top ones, and where a lot of important people in history were ranked, the 10th and 15th and down the line. So it's interesting how that
Well, where do they have Christ?
Christ was number 2. And one of the
Oh, okay.
behind
Number 2.
Yeah, he's number 2. He's number 2, and behind Muhammad. And I think in another poll that I saw, I think Muhammad was 1, Sir Isaac Newton was 2nd, and Christ was 3rd, I believe. In another of those lists that I saw. So kind of interesting. Go ahead, Charlie. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ignore you there.
Well, nothing, all that went on. Dalai Lama couldn't do anything about it.
How's that? I didn't understand that. What was that?
I said everything went on back then,
Oh, the Dalai Lama? Yeah.
and Dalai Lama couldn't deal with it.
Yeah, where's he from? Tibet or something?
Yes, what do you
I
know?
think so.
Tibet, yeah.
They had him on the Today Show one time,
Yeah.
Dalai Lama,
Yeah.
and they didn't put him on as soon as he thought they ought to, so he left.
Yeah.
They never got a chance to.
He's the one that showed a while back kissing some of the boys or something, I think.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
wasn't that him?
yeah,
I
like
think-
a year ago.
Yeah, I think it was, yes. Boy. Well, I was thought about reading it, but it's so lengthy. It's 44 verses, so we won't do that. You can kind of read that on your own, but let's just begin kind of summing it up. Oh, by the way, I wanted to ask y'all. I mentioned this before. Israel was teaching Hebrews in the Sunday morning class, right?
Yes, sir.
And I thought about either teaching Hebrews or the book of John. I've kind of settled on John since Israel's already doing Hebrews. Do y'all have a particular, either a topic or a book that you like? I just suggested John or Hebrews, but if y'all got something else that you would like, I'll entertain that.
I like
Okay.
James.
James?
I like the book of James,
James?
but I like
Okay.
John too, so
All
it doesn't matter.
Well, we could do James. It'd be fine with me. Anybody have another suggestion?
It's so much like Proverbs as far as teaching
Well,
how.
Yeah.
It's just, sometimes it's just not fair because it's all good,
Yeah.
It's like going up to a menu, you're like,
I know.
which one am I?
And those 108 verses of James it's just chock full of, I mean, every verse almost you could spend a class period on just about. Yeah. You
It's the
could,
Proverbs of the New Testament.
Absolutely.
Someone say.
absolutely. It sure is. Absolutely. Yeah, I've got a good commentary too on Book of James, I think. So if we want to do that,
John's
that's
a good
fine.
book too.
Yeah.
Keith wrote a commentary on John, I believe. so-
Yeah, sure did. I could use his. Can just read it.
Yes.
Just read Keith.
It's through that first name and all,
Absolutely. All right. Okay, let's look at this real quick. I say real quick. We'll get as far as we can get. Verses 1 to 2 was determined that they would go to Italy and deliver Paul and other prisoners. It doesn't say who or how many and so forth at that particular point in time, to a centurion named Julius. The only thing really we know about him was he was a Roman officer, and it's kind of favorable. He was one of those that's a favorable Roman officer, if you want to look at it that way. And B.W. Johnson mentioned that there were several Roman officials that Paul came in contact with that either helped him or listened to him, or he mentioned Sergius Paulus, Gallio, Felix, Festus, and Julius, kind of in the same category, as it were. Of the Augustan band, Johnson used the word cohort, and I looked that up to find out what a cohort. I know what it is, but I wanted to get a definition of it, and I found the definition of it, that a cohort, if I'm pronouncing it right, is the 10th part of a legion, and a legion is a division of the Roman army of some 3,000 to 6,000 foot soldiers. So a cohort would be 300 to 600 men. They divide them into 10 cohorts. And so you'd have a cohort is 1/10 of a legion. So you had 10 of those. And so that would be a division of the Roman army of 300 to 600 at a time in a group, which was called the Augustan band. Jonathan had a little comment even about the Augustan band. He says, Josephus says that during this period, one of the cohorts stationed at Caesarea took the name of Augustus. So, and we talked about that before, that Augustus really was a title rather than the name of Caesar, but they called him Augustus Caesar, the August one, that sort of thing. So we looked at that before. They got a ship of Adramyttium. This city was on the Asiatic coast of the Aegean Sea. And so then at that point, you had two of Paul's companions that were with him. The we there evidently was Luke, which most believe that was. And then he mentions a second one, Aristarchus. There, I think it's in verse 2 maybe. A Macedonian. He's also named in Acts 19:29 and Acts 20 and verse 4. And also mentioned, I believe, in Colossians 4 and verse 10, talking about Aristarchus, where he was mentioned as being a fellow prisoner at one time. He called him his fellow prisoner, I think, in Colossians 4 and verse 10. If I remember correctly. And then the next day after they sailed, the next day we touched at Sidon, verse 3. Sidon was about 67 miles north of Caesarea. And we mentioned that a while ago. We won't go back through all of that, but it looks close to that, but it's not. Where you got Caesarea here and this Sidon. So that gives you an idea of the distance there. If you start measuring it, like an inch at a time or whatever, how many miles it might be. But Wayne Jackson says about 60 miles. B.W. Johnson says 67, so I won't quibble with that. Verses 4 and 5, they sailed under Cyprus or near the eastern coast of Cyprus. The wind must have been from the northwest, Johnson says. And he mentions the geographical detail of this voyage. It was so accurate that it must have been written by an eyewitness. And so the eyewitness, of course, was Luke, where he mentions we there in verse 1. And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, so Luke is the one writing this. And he mentions and all the things that he knew about the voyage, the distances, the weather, the hurricane or whatever that was, the Euroclydon that he mentions a little bit later on, and the various details of the trip was quite interesting. In verses 6 to 8, they found a ship of Alexandria. Johnson says this was a grain ship and a real big ship that would hold from 500 to 1,000 tons of cargo. They sailed slowly because of the contrary winds. They went from Myra to Nidus, which was only 137 miles. So when they got up across on the other side of Cyprus, you got Myra here, and then you've got Nidus here. So as they came this way, they didn't actually get to Nidus, but they sailed on down because of the winds and because of the difficulty of sailing. They were planning on just going more westerly, but then they had to go south because of the weather and so forth. He said
They changed ships there at Myra.
Yeah, changed ships at Myra. There was 3 different ships that he was on this particular voyage, and this was I don't know if this was the second one or third one, Lord, I can't remember.
There's not very many things in the Bible, subjects to be picked, they're described as thoroughly as this chapter describes that voyage. I mean, it's
Pinpoint.
interesting reading.
Everything's pinpoint, absolutely.
Like
It sure does.
a novel or something.
Quickie.
Well, in history class, it's interesting to talk about the geography and all that in the book of Acts. There was a guy named Sir William Ramsay, who became a great Bible archaeologist and geography type deal. But he went to school at Oxford or Cambridge, one of those, and all the teachers there kind of made him start doubting the Bible and all that. So he actually went to these places to show how the Bible was not true.
Yeah,
And he became convinced that it was.
yeah.
So he became a firm believer looking at Acts.
At this
these
chapter and all.
places. He was so
Yeah.
blown away by the accuracy
Yeah,
of Luke's account.
yeah,
I
exactly.
thought was interesting.
Yeah, that was interesting to me too, because let's see if I can find that statement that he makes there. I should have read it a while ago when I had it. Well, he just mentions that the geographical details of this voyage are so accurate that they must have been written by an eyewitness. But there was another statement that was made about that. I'll find it later on. But yeah, it's so precise, the whole voyage, and where he was, where he landed, when they were trying to get to Nidus. But he makes mention of the fact that, let's see if I can find his statement here. It says that from Nidus, they ought to have sailed west, but the headwinds compelled them to direct their course to the south, where they took shelter under the island of Crete. The winds were still evidently from the northwest. With difficulty, they reached a place called Fair Havens on the south coast of Crete, and it retains the same name to this day. It's a roadstead near the city of Lasea. It was supposed that all trace of this city was lost until recently, but it is now known that the natives apply this name to the ruins of an ancient town about 5 miles from Fair Havens. So it's still in existence even today. And when B.W. Johnson wrote that was 130 years ago, thereabouts, when he made mention of that. So, and then in verses 9 to 13, Charles, you have something? Okay. In verses 9 to 13, it says, when much time was spent, and how long we don't know, the sailing was now dangerous on account of the season of the year. In the winter, not only the storms, but the clouds and darkness interfered with navigation. Mariners, in the absence of a compass, needed the sun and stars to direct their course. Because the fast was past, that of the Day of Atonement, which came in October. I think that was the way we would look at it would be July, in the 7th month. Was the 7th month at the 10th day, I think, you Bible scholars, I think.
For which part?
The Day of Atonement, was
Yes,
that the
7th month.
July and our July would be July the 10th. Of course,
Their calendar will start mid-March.
yeah, July, August, September. Yeah, and he said that the rough weather, the main rough weather, I think, was from September the 14th to November the 11th. They had it kind of pinned down as to really the bad timing or the bad weather. And of course, Paul knew all of this, evidently, and which he warned them, more than once not to venture out. First of all, not to venture at this particular point in time, but they didn't listen to him and so forth. But Paul's experiences taught him the danger of proceeding, and said that this Day of Atonement came in October. He said, "Sir, as I perceive, this is going to be dangerous," and so forth. That's in verses 9 to 13. The centurion gave more heed. The master of the captain or the owner was aboard, and so they overruled Paul. And they proceeded on, and the Fair Havens was not a good harbor. They hoped to reach a better one. They thought they could get to Phoenix or Phenice, Phenice. That was never reached. It would have been a good place for wintering. They had an excellent harbor, which Johnson said remains to this day. When the south wind blew, they supposed they could attain their purpose. They sailed along the southern shore of Crete to reach, if possible, Phoenix. Then that's when the storm arose, called Euroclydon. The description is kind of like a hurricane. The ship was caught up in that. The ship was powerless to do anything. They ran under a certain island called Cauda, C-A-U-D-A. Some spell it C-L-A-U-D-A. It lies a little south of Crete. And then they had to undergird the ship, kind of the whole hull, trying to keep it intact, to put ropes and so forth around it, to tighten it up, to strengthen it and so forth, because the wooden vessels at that point was in great peril of breaking up. And they thought they might fall into the quicksands. if you look on the map there, it's called Syrtis, Syrtis, or quicksands on the African coast to the southwest of Crete. And then they strake sail. Johnson says that nautical men say that this language implies that most of their sails were furled or rolled up, only a small sail remaining set. They were going to ride out the storm, but they, as a result of that, they began to drift. Their aim was to keep from being driven into the quicksands, and so they lightened the ship. They threw things overboard. The third day of the storm, they threw out a lot of the heavier equipment to lighten it even more. It said that neither sun nor stars appeared in many days. So without a compass, it was very difficult. They just had to just let it go where it's going to go, and that's basically what took place. And then verses 21 to 28, the anxiety, of course, set in. They were so upset that they wouldn't eat anything. Paul told them, "You should have hearkened to me. You should have listened to me." But he said, "An angel spoke to me last night, an angel of God." He said, I serve this God, whose I am and whom I serve." What a great statement that is, whose I am and whom I serve. And Johnson says that this short sentence is a sermon. It's a keynote of all of Paul's ministry. Israel, you might want to prepare a sermon of that one day. He said this would be a good topic for a sermon. Whose I am and whom I serve. So he said, "Fear not. Nobody's going to lose their life." The ship, of course, we're going to be on a certain island. And that was kind of interesting. The island that they wound up on, Malta or Melita, Johnson mentioned, is 17 miles by 9 miles. But if you look out in the ocean, it's almost nothing. This is it right here. So when they were going, after they left the Fair Havens and they went up and down in Adria, it doesn't mean the Adriatic Sea, according to it just means the western part of the Mediterranean Sea, I guess, where it was going back and forth to some degree. And this island here, that's called Malta or Melita, Johnson said is 17 miles long by about 9 miles. I think it's 17 miles long by 9 miles wide. And so out in the middle of nowhere, out in the middle of the ocean, or in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. So they feared lest when they sounded, they put down the anchors to see how deep it was. It was 20 fathoms. A fathom is 6 feet or thereabouts. So you're talking about 120 feet deep. So it was, the water there was 120 feet deep. And then they sounded again, and it became more shallow. So as a result of that, they knew that they were getting closer to shore. So as a result of that, they feared, running into rocks and so forth. So they cast anchor, and it said they wished for the day. So they were just going to kind of ride it out at that particular point in time. So they threw out 4 anchors. Because it was needed to kind of hold the ship where it wouldn't drift anymore. So the shipmen were about to flee, and it was really important for them to stay on the ship, because Paul said, unless you abide on the ship, you can't be saved. But they were fixing to abandon ship. So they just let it anchor there, or drift, whatever was doing. And Paul, in verses 33 to 38, Paul tried to get them to take some meat. They finally did. He took some meat, and because they hadn't had anything, he said, for about 14 days. So you can imagine how weak they must have been, not having any regular meals because of the anxiety and stress and so forth that they were all under. And Paul told them that this is for your health. Said there's not a hair going to from anybody's head that's going to fall. A promise of absolute safety. He took bread. He gave thanks, which of course the Bible tells us to do. That Paul was wanting to do that before eating and so forth. And of course we have the example of Christ doing the same as well. He began to eat. He encouraged them. They took some meat. It mentions there were 276 people on board at that point. They lightened the ship to the degree that they could. And so they were going to try to let it get to shore, but it came upon some rocks or something that tore the boat apart. They would find that in 39 to 44. They discovered a certain creek at that point, or a certain bay, as it were, a beach of some kind. It says they determined to try to thrust the ship toward that beach. And of course, when they did, the shallow water and so forth, that the boat was broken to some degree, and they did what they could when the ship was beginning to break up and so forth. They actually ran it aground, evidently, and the soldiers said, we're going to kill the prisoners. And so Paul evidently, the centurion, who evidently had some favor with Paul, said, no, we're not going to kill him and so forth. He commanded that if you can swim to shore, swim. If you can't get on some of the wood and so forth, float to shore. And there's not anyone that got killed. I think, does the Bible say that it thrice he suffered shipwreck?
Yes.
In 2 Corinthians 11:25, I think it is.
It doesn't count this one.
Yeah,
So it'd be interesting to know. I wish we
Yeah.
knew when those other three happened.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
not told.
yeah. So at least it was 4, right? Yeah. So that pretty much completes that. Yeah, 2 Corinthians 11:25, I think, is where he mentions that. So any thoughts before we leave that? We'll get into 28 next week, and then
One thing that's interesting to me, a lot of times when it comes to matters of what must have to do to be saved, people argue against baptism and say,
Yeah.
well, somebody's for the gift, which it is. But, you look at a passage like Acts 27:24, God says, I've given you all those on board. But then in verse 31, he gave a condition, except these stay on the ship, they can't be saved. So the fact that they obeyed God, that nullified the gift.
yeah,
That was
Good
part of the
point.
condition of
Yeah.
receiving that gift.
yeah, absolutely. Good point. Excellent point.